Elevator.
I saw that room. You know, the people teach to, I think, care of patients
Monday.
Belgian power.
Hold this. You're gonna speak and you don't need to hold that. Save just for you.
Thank you, Lord.
I always think it's like these. Yeah. Like the dog. I know.
It's hard to give you a little introduction that you needed.
I know I do. I'm not sure.
But I thought that's right. Oh, mostly the
Morning. Good morning. And welcome to our Saturday morning program. It's nice to see so many of you here. Our speaker this morning is Paul Mange Johansson, who was actually a classmate of many, several, I would say, children of residents here at Applewood. After high school, Paul earned a BA in biology at Yale. And his favorite, I can turn my voice up. How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Paul is now graduating from high school and he earned a BA in biology at Yale. But his favorite course at Yale was medical history. And his lifelong passion for Hansen's disease, the topic for today, began in that course. After graduation, while working at the psychiatric epidemiology unit at Mass General Hospital, Paul discovered the field of biostatistics, and he went on to earn an MA in that field in 1997. Paul currently works as a biostatistician at Berkshire Medical Center in Pittsfield, and he teaches math as an adjunct faculty member at Berkshire Community College. You may have seen Paul here at Applewood more than a few times. His parents are Arthur and Elaine Mange. Paul is married to Katrina Matson, who is here today. And we, of course, and they live with their children, Naomi and Emmanuel. title of Paul's talk you cannot miss. I actually asked him to be sure that the letter was large enough, and he obviously honored my request. I would like you now to welcome Paul. Thank you for coming, Paul.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about this topic. As I was putting this presentation together, it sort of dawned on me that this is my life's work. So I have a little display here. I'll be showing some of these during the talk. There's another little display over there. I've had a number of exhibits on this topic over the years. And so this is the condensed version of some of those exhibits. I want to dedicate my talk today to Sam Michella, who was a dermatologist at the Leahy Clinic and ran the Hansen's disease clinic there, which is still in existence. I've occasionally visited. They meet once a month, and the patients come to the Leahy Clinic from all over New England. And you'll meet some of my other friends as we talk about this topic, many of whom have had Hansen's disease themselves. So here's our outline. There are really two topics that I want to talk about because they have connections to New England. The big topic is the Penikese Island Hospital. Other than my wife and my parents, has anybody ever heard of the Penikese Island Hospital before? And Nancy Eddy, thank you. All right, so that's the main focus of my talk. I do want to talk a little bit about Joseph Dutton, who was born and grew up in Stowe, Vermont. I'm putting an asterisk near that topic for reasons that we'll talk about in a little bit. But in order to talk about those topics, I need to talk about a few other topics. First, I want to introduce the disease itself, so you have some grounding in what it is. Spoiler alert, it's a bacteria. And I got into this topic, as Kathy said, through a medical history course I took 35 years ago. And I wrote a paper on, so Hansen's disease is named after a Norwegian physician, Armauer Hansen, who in 1873 discovered not only the cause of leprosy, but the first bacterial illness of them all. That's it. This was the first. So it's a remarkable story for that reason and for lots of other reasons that I don't have time to get into, but I will allude to them hopefully. And in order to talk about Joseph Dutton, I need to tell you about Father Damien. How many people have heard of Father Damien? Yeah. Good guy. Saint Damien. And then we have a special guest at the end, Eve Rifkah, who's sitting in the front row, who's a poet from Worcester and has written a book of poetry from the perspective of the patients at Penikese, which is lovely. And she will read a couple of her poems just before we wrap up, and we'll open it up for questions. So with that, let me start with the disease itself, right? Spoiler alert, it's a bacteria. Mycobacterium leprae was the name given to this bacterium. Tuberculosis is also a mycobacterium. They are cousins. As I mentioned, this was literally the first human disease attributed to a bacteria, which I think is stunning. And I still don't know exactly why Hansen was convinced it was bacterial. He was years, if not decades, ahead of his time in that conviction. And of course, in the work that ultimately led to the discovery. There's a huge difference between leprosy and tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is one of the most contagious diseases out there. Leprosy is one of the least contagious diseases out there. In fact, 95% of every person on the face of the earth could never get it if they spent their life trying. It is physically impossible. 95% are just immune, period. And if you're unlucky enough to be in that 5%, what it requires is prolonged exposure. And as we'll see, that led people astray. There's so many things about this bacterium physically that have led people astray. And there's still many questions we don't know about the bacterium. But it requires prolonged exposure. Therefore, Hansen's boss, who was the world's expert on leprosy at the time, was convinced it was hereditary because it looks like a hereditary disease. It runs in family because the susceptibility is genetic, presumably, and the exposure is also runs in families. And Hansen discovered the bacterium in 1873. His boss died in 1905, convinced it was hereditary. Interesting fact. Furthermore, if you're in the 5% that's susceptible and you're unlucky to have prolonged exposure, it takes years for symptoms to occur. It's probably the slowest growing bacterium of any that I know in the human disease realm. And that's a problem if you're studying it, because how do you figure out where you got it? If you got it years ago, right? Where were you 20 years ago, right? Who can give me a history of every place they've been in the last 20 years, right? People could have gotten it anywhere. There's some likely candidates, which we'll talk about in a second. Furthermore, if you're in the 5% and you're exposed and you happen to show symptoms, the symptoms that you show are incredibly wide ranging. And the reason for that is that your clinical symptoms depend on your immunologic response to the bacteria. And it's a huge spectrum, right? Most diseases, you have a very narrow, you have a pattern of symptoms that are, indicative that you have disease X, right? Tuberculosis, you cough, bloody cough. You've got tuberculosis, right? Doesn't take a rocket scientist to diagnose tuberculosis. Does take a rocket scientist to diagnose leprosy for a lot of reasons. Also because it's so rare. Ironically, a little bit, it is a tropical disease. It mostly occurs along the equator. However, if you are somebody who has the disease, the bacteria likes the cooler parts of your body, your nose, your ears, your fingers, your toes. Why? I don't exactly know. That's just the way it is. Here it is. This is the bacteria. This is what all the fuss is about. And if you look at the upper left corner, that blue slide has the benefit of stain, right? If you're a microbiologist and you study something, the first thing you do is you color your slide so you can see stuff. Hansen couldn't do that, right? Imagine looking at that without any color and saying, oh, I see these tiny little things in there. Right? First of all, without a great microscope. Second of all, to make the connection between what I'm seeing very faintly under the microscope is what's causing these deformities in the people long before we had treatment. That was his inspiration. The upper right is a electron micrograph. So you're looking at the outside of these bacteria. They're rod-shaped. Bottom right is a transmission electron micrograph. This is looking inside the bacteria. And if anybody wants to look it up, there's a website. For the geneticists in the audience, I have a slide talking about the genome. And what's interesting is that compared to its cousin, tuberculosis, which has about 4,000 genes, leprosy, the leprosy bacillus only has about 1,600, so less than half. Most of the genome appears to be cluttered with more than 1,100 pseudogenes, right? Which look like tuberculosis, but are no longer active. Interesting. I mentioned your immune response to this disease follows a huge spectrum. There are kind of two ends of that spectrum. On the one end, you have called TT, the tuberculoid end. In this graph, it's the end on the right. The far right is a healthy contact. That's 95% of people. But if you have the disease and you have the cell-mediated response, that's on the right. And then on the left, you have what's called the lepromatous leprosy. That's a more antibody response as opposed to a cell-mediated response. There are lots of ways of breaking this down and deciding where people fall on the spectrum. Probably not that interesting to you, but it's called the Ridley-Jopling classification. There are other classification systems. This is the one we've settled on over the decades. The top here has a 7-category classification. The Ridley-Jopling is on the bottom. And here's a little bit more detail about that. CMI, now tuberculoid, is on the left, is immunological response. BI, essentially your B cells making antibodies. The low chromatous end of the spectrum is on the right, and these show different symptoms. It's almost like 2 different diseases. Again, lots of details. These are slides of the various 5 categories. It is treatable. It's a bacterium. Since the 1940s, there have been effective antibiotics to treat leprosy. These days, and it didn't take them long, well, it took them a little bit long to develop the drugs, but once they developed them, it didn't take them that long to figure out you need 3 of them. Anybody know why we need 3 antibiotics?
So if immunity develops to one, then that ruins
Right.
the ability. But if you give several, they are almost impossibly going to be.
A+. The response is,
Could you repeat the answer?
yes, I can. So it's possible if you just treat it with 1 antibiotic that the bacteria will respond accordingly through evolutionary processes to develop resistance. It is, if you give 2, it's highly unlikely that the bacterium will simultaneously create resistance to 2 antibiotics. If you give 3, right, the chances, I'm a statistician, they go way down. So that's the idea. One other thing, these bacteria, these antibiotics, were tested at Carville. Has anybody heard of Carville? Besides my wife and my mother and my father. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Will we? Let me say a couple words now. So Carville is a town in Louisiana. How many people know who's from Carville, Louisiana? James Carville is from Carville, Louisiana. Right? So it's named after his family. And Betty Martin wrote this New York Times best-selling book, Miracle at Carville, because she was one of the patients. She was one of the first people in the history of humanity to have curable leprosy. The other thing that's interesting, it's a little hard to see maybe, thalidomide is an effective treatment for leprosy. FYI, it's not a standard treatment, but if for some reason these 3 antibiotics fail, we've got others that are effective. Obviously, not if you were pregnant. I mentioned it's a tropical disease. Here's from 2017, incidence of leprosy, mainly India and Brazil, but some other places, tiny bit in the US, tiny bit in Australia, tiny bit in China. So here's my first friend that I will introduce you to. Naren Chirmalay is the gentleman sitting down with the mustache. We were colleagues at Merck and fairly quickly discovered that we both had this interest in leprosy. I started through the history of leprosy. He started because he's an immunologist, and his thesis was A, a long time ago, but B, trying to develop a vaccine for leprosy, which we don't have. It's not for lack of trying, it's because it's a very difficult bacteria. So if you have it these days, what are the first indications you have it? That's it, a rash. In addition to having a rash, it infects the nerves. And what that means is you have insensitive patches. So this person could stick a pin in that rash and not feel it. Right? There are a lot of things that cause a rash. There are very few things that cause a rash that you can stick a pin in and not feel it. Right? But it's not high on doctors' lists. So when they see a rash, they're not running off to stick a pin in it. to see if they can feel it or not. It's probably a good thing. Let me introduce you to a few other people with leprosy. This is a teenager in Louisiana, B.B. Blanchard, who discovered in 2008 she was diagnosed with leprosy. You would never know it by looking at her. This is a story in People magazine. She's a regular teenager, right? They caught it early. The other thing about antibiotic treatment is they gave it for a year just to make sure that this bacteria is not going anywhere. And the treatment can't reverse the effects of the disease. It'll stop it from progressing, but wherever you are at the point you begin treatment, that's where you stay. So you want to catch it before there's a lot of nerve damage, which most people do these days. Here's another friend of mine, Jose Ramirez, who was a patient at Carville for many years, from Laredo, Texas. And he is a social worker now and has his life's work is educating people about leprosy. He's participated. This is a picture of him at a panel that I organized back in 2004. And he's talking about the stigma of the disease, what it's like to have it and live with it. So as a medical student, in 1991, I visited Carville for the first time. I've been there a couple times. I believe that was the first time I met people who had lived with leprosy, with Hansen's disease. In the upper left corner is Julia Elwood. She was a patient who was discharged. And as you can imagine, because of the stigma, it's not always easy to live essentially with a scarlet letter on your back. And what she found after she was discharged is that she liked it much better at the hospital. So she came back and she was an employee at the hospital. The central picture is Joe McIntosh. He's a patient who I met because he's the one who gives the tours at Carville. Lovely gentleman. The right-hand gentleman is the librarian at Carville. It's a pretty huge facility, federal facility, and they have lots of services. It's really the, I think it's safe to say the world's center for leprosy treatment. They've developed a lot of treatments. You may notice the librarian has big boots on his feet. A lot of the treatment for insensitive hands and feet that were developed at Carville also apply to diabetes. So if there's anything good that came about it, it's that some of the treatments for this disease apply more generally. There's an arts and crafts program. Carville is an amazing place. I would be happy to talk about that for an hour, but no time. I visited Hawaii. Has anybody heard of Kalapapa on the island of Molokai? Very historic settlement and not for good reasons. That's where Father Damien did his work. I visited in 2005 and met Richard Marks on the left and Olivia Breifkah on the right. They have both since passed. Richard was a lovely, fascinating gentleman. I'll tell one quick story about him, which is he escaped from Kalapapa. Actually, yeah, and the fact that he escaped meant it happened before he was allowed to leave. It was actually part of the process that allowed them to lift the quarantine. But before they lifted the quarantine, he escaped. And he was found. And the reason he was found is that he continued to take his antibiotics. And there's nothing else in the world that those three antibiotics in combination are used for except leprosy. So they tracked him through his pharmacy. And he came back and decided to stay and became an activist. Olivia, quick story, lovely woman, became an activist as a result of watching an episode of MASH, which I watched as a kid. And how many people remember Winchester, the character on MASH? So on one of the episodes, he made an offhand comment about his squalid living conditions, saying something like, what am I, a leper? Like, Why can't they treat me better? And that made Olivia mad. So she wrote an autobiography. And she sent it to Alan Alda. And they became friends, actually. Here's her autobiography. And essentially, that she's the person I think most of when I think of how to reduce stigma, right? These are people with a bacterial infection, right? They have been horribly mistreated for many reasons. But the quote that most comes from her book is, right, I am not defined by my disease. I'm a person. I'm not a leper. So I got to talk to her before she passed. This is Richard's obituary. Again, fascinating story. He and his wife ran the tours at Kalapapa, which is how I got to meet him. And that's the disease. All right, probably not too bad. I'm going to speed things up, but I do want to talk a little bit about the discovery of the bacteria. This is Hansen, Armauer Hansen, Gerhard Heinrich Armauer Hansen, Norwegian physician at the leprosy, what's now the Leprosy Museum. It was then the Leprosy Hospital in Bergen, Norway. And as you'll see in a couple slides, this is the iconic image of Hansen looking through his microscope. This is probably early 1900s, so this is 20, 30 years after he made his discovery. Couple quick facts about the discovery. Bergen was the center of global studies for leprosy in the 19th century. There was a ton of leprosy in Norway. And his boss was the world's leading expert, Daniel Cornelius Danielson. He believed, and not without good reason, that leprosy was hereditary. And as I mentioned, he went to the grave believing it was hereditary. And in 1847, he published the definitive work, a couple definitive works on leprosy, which sort of established him as the world's expert and Bergen as the center for leprosy studies. Hansen came into this environment in 1868, 2 years after he got his medical degree. And again, for reasons I'm still not 100% sure of, he was just convinced that leprosy was bacterial. My guess is in his medical studies, people in Norway are remarkably smart and remarkably up to date on everything happening in the world. So he probably learned there's this new concept out there that maybe bacteria cause disease. And so he just took this and ran with it. That's the best I can come up with. But even then, it took him years, for reasons we talked about, looking under a microscope without staining techniques, to become convinced to attach that thing he was seeing under the microscope to the disease. Furthermore, he published his findings in Norwegian. All the Norwegian physicians read it, and nobody else does, right? So there's a young German researcher, Albert Neisser, who just later discovered gonorrhea, Neisseria gonorrhea, named after Albert Neisser, who visited Bergen. Hansen said, I think I have a bacterial disease here. And Neisser said, I'm not so sure. So Hansen gave him samples, introduced him to all the cases. Neisser went back to Germany, stained it because he was working with the people who developed staining techniques, and published a paper saying, guess what? I just discovered leprosy, right? And Hansen, you know, he didn't really care, to be honest. It was his boss who said, I'm sorry, this is unacceptable. You need to publish in English and German, which he did, and which is why it's called Hansen's disease, not Neisser's disease. So here's the Atlas, 1847. Here's the Leprosy Now Museum and Hospital. The one on the right is literally the Norwegian publication from 1874. And now we get to Penikese. So Massachusetts, Penikese Island is in Massachusetts, had a hospital for people with leprosy from 1905 to 1921. Little known fact for various reasons. This is a picture I took on my first visit to Penikese many years ago. Very remote. There's a reason for that, which we'll get to. So to orient you to where Penikese is, lower right, Martha's Vineyard. Top, Woods Hole, upper left, Fall River, right? So there's your triangle. These are the Elizabeth Islands, a string of islands that run off of Falmouth and Woods Hole. And Noshawn, Ask Island, Nashawina, Cuttyhunk, Penikese. There it is. Can't even see it on a map that is blown up. Here's what it looks like up close. It's 74 acres. And my favorite description from some of the early writings of when the state bought the property was they said it has an outline not unlike that of the crookneck squash. I like that. This is a picture I took looking this direction. So off the tip, this is the tip of Penikese. That's Cuttyhunk. That's Nashawina, right? You can see them. They're not that far away. You could probably row a boat there if you wanted. All right, let's talk about why Penikese. In 1904, there were 4 cases of leprosy in Massachusetts. 4, count them. They were all immigrants. And by law, they belonged at the state hospital. It was in Tewksbury, now also a museum, public health museum, and still a functioning hospital. The state hospital would not take them. It just refused. The attorney general said, you have to, that's the law. We have laws for these things. That's what the law says. And they said, we're not taking them. So the State Board of Charity, which was charged with doing something about this huge problem for patients, purchased a farm in Brewster. Immediately, there was a petition. Not here. The cranberry industry was just beginning. People were worried about tourism on the Cape, even back then. One of the sort of classic quote from one of the petitioners, I'm full of sympathy for them. My heart is warm for them, but I, for one, do not want to see them on Cape Cod. Can't have it in Brewster. So the State Board of Charity bought Penikese Island and said, that's it. You can't get any more remote than this. That's where they're going. Even that was protested, but they set up a hospital. So the first 5 patients by then, 1905, November, arrived. And over that 16-year period, there were a total of 36 patients, most of them 33 immigrants. You can see here where they came from. Language barrier was a big problem. Many of them did not speak English. The first superintendent only lasted a year, Dr. Lewis Edmonds. In came Dr. Frank Parker and his wife Marion from Malden, who really were responsible for this hospital. And as we'll see in a few minutes, they were remarkably human in their treatment of these patients for various reasons. And you'll see pictures of them in a second. A couple quick points on the history of Penikese. There's a massive fire in 1912 that destroyed the administration building along with all the patient records. So what did the Parkers do? They could have said, we're out of here, we're going back to Malden. They lived in the barn with the animals until they could build a new administration building for them. So they were not giving up on the patients. To me, there's a lot written about the Parkers, and it's incredibly heartwarming. But to me, what speaks most to the Parkers' relationship with the patients is the fact that for about 2 years, 3 years, there was a research relationship between the hospital and Harvard. And there was a physician, Dr. James Honeyeye from South Africa, who was largely responsible for running the experiments and wrote a ton of papers. It so happened that during this time, many patients died. Whether it was because of the research or not is an open-ended question. I don't think so, but other people do. And Parker said, that's it. Sorry, you can't do research anymore. If this is going to kill the patients. He wasn't saying it did. Correlation is not causation, but he stopped that research program, right? So his research interest took a backseat to the treatment of the patients. It closed in 1921, the reason being Carville in Louisiana became a federal facility, not a state facility. And so the last 13 patients were shipped by train to Louisiana, not without protest from every single state in between Massachusetts and Louisiana. All right, this was the reason the hospital gave for not accepting the patients. We feel we should be neglectful of our duty should we consent to such transfers, thereby exposing 15 or 1,800 inmates, more or less, to that much dreaded disease. We also feel confident that the action we have taken will be sustained and approved by the public. That was their reason. They had tuberculosis in this hospital, vastly more contagious, and they wouldn't take 4 patients with leprosy against the law. This is a quote that basically says how isolating Penikese is. It's not surprising that the temper of gregarious man cannot long endure it. The first superintendent couldn't take it. Dr. Parker and his wife had earnest, winning characters and rare good courage. Absolutely a #1 job requirement. There were people even at that time who knew that the reaction was way out of proportion from a medical standpoint. This quote from James White I like, because it says, the fear of leprosy, it would be better for mankind if the fear of leprosy were divided up and bestowed in impartial measure upon tuberculosis and syphilis as well. Dr. Honier also had a pretty good relationship with the patients and was forward thinking. The fear of leprosy is a strange inheritance from the Middle Ages, which has remained with us largely because of imperfect knowledge, which remains today. We still have imperfect knowledge. Here are some patients. Even back then, before treatment, they don't look so bad. These are the early days. Isabel Barros, Lucy Peterson, Yi Toy, Charles Beals, Flavia Barros on the right. These are the patient records they kept at the time, index cards. And the only reason I'm able to show you these is that it is now more than 100 years since the hospital closed. And my colleague at the Department of Public Health said, 90 years, we probably could have released them. 100 years, now it's okay. One of the patients whose story I especially liked was a high school student from Upton, Massachusetts, Archie Thomas, whose mother came to live with him and take care of him. And very quickly, the story of Archie Thomas is he was a nerd, right? And he liked radios. And so he set up a wireless operating machine, which allowed him to communicate with the outside world. That's how they got news of World War I. That's how he conveyed, there's a major fire, please send help. It arrived late, but it wasn't Archie's fault. He did what he could. He was a minor celebrity, even in his day. I think he died at age 22. I think his obituary was in the New York Times. This is where the patients lived. They're on the nasty side of the island that gets all the breeze from incoming. There's Dr. Parker and his wife. Minor story, and I'll try to speed things up. Dr. Parker was refused his pension by the governor of Massachusetts. If you can imagine a more egregious insult. It took a long time, but the Senator Turkington from that area about 10, maybe 20 years ago, I lose track of time, put this plaque up in the State House. There's a nurse's hall, and this is where it sits. My contribution, I'm pleased to say, when I was shown a draft of the plaque was, you should probably add his wife. She was really pretty important. So that's my contribution. Here's some statistics about patients. This just briefly was the period. So flat means there are a lot of people dying at the same time. This is the period where they had the research program, right? It's flat, but it's not that much flatter than the subsequent few years. And this is when the 13 remaining patients were sent to Carville, and their life expectancy immediately shot up, even though we didn't have antibiotics at that time. Here are the journal articles Dr. Honier published, lots and lots. After they closed the hospital, they dynamited all the buildings. There was one building that refused to be dynamited. This is the laundry facility, which Yitoy was paid. He was from China, and they thought, let's pay him to do the laundry, which he was happy to do to get income. Well, I don't know if he was happy, but he did it. There are 14 patients buried on Penikese. First time I visited, this was what the grave markers looked like. This is what they look like now. So a quick word about Tom Buckley. After it was closed, it remained vacant for many, many years, until the 70s, maybe, when there was a school for troubled boys, basically. Tom Buckley worked at that school, and because he was on Penikese, this is a picture of him by the outhouse, very funny guy. He got interested in the history, and Penikese, the hospital, is not the only interesting history. There was a naturalist school that preceded the hospital for birds. But he wrote this book, Penikese Island of Hope. He was the first, I don't know how he got access to the patient records, but he must have gotten access because he published information on each one of them. There's a short blurb, and I've got the book here, on every one of those patients. And again, the reason I mention that, as we'll see in a second, is that that was the book, and Eve will speak about this, that got Eve interested in the subject. And we'll get to Eve in just a minute. You see my time. All right, let me run through a little bit of stuff quickly. Father Damien on Kalapapa. These are the Hawaiian Islands. That is Molokai. And the little tongue in the middle is where 8,000 people with leprosy were sent, starting in 1865. That little tongue of land itself is on an island and is separated by cliffs. This is 2,000 feet high. If you look closely, this is a switchback path, 26 switchbacks. I walked that. It's possible to walk. There's a mule ride company. The more common way to get there is to take a mule down the path, right? Incredibly remote. Father Damien was from Belgium, and he came to Molokai in 1873. Interesting year, same year Hansen discovered the bacterium. And he was warned ahead of time, don't get too close to the patients. And he ignored that advice. He would treat the wounds of the patients. He's a priest, so these are his minions. That's not the right word. And as a result, he is one of the few people who contracted leprosy, entirely preventable, and it was his choice. And the way he discovered he had leprosy was in December 1884, 20 years after he got there. He stuck his foot in boiling water and didn't feel a thing. That was what tipped him off. So he is now a saint. Long story short, there he is early in his time with a number of residents and the mules in the background. Here he is literally on his deathbed. The picture here is the day he was buried with all of the patients around his grave. I would love to talk about Robert Louis Stevenson. And the reason is Robert Louis Stevenson was recovering from tuberculosis and really wanted to meet Father Damien. So he went to Molokai just after Father Damien died. And he spent a week there. And I say this because this book, An Open Letter to the Reverend Dr. Hyde from Honolulu, was his response to the Reverend Hyde writing a letter. First of all, Father Damien was also world renowned in his day, which you can imagine in those days is a real feat. No social media. People knew Father Damien. Reverend Hyde wrote a letter saying, well, everybody knows leprosy is a sexually transmitted disease. So what do we think about Father Damien now? And Robert Louis Stevenson wrote a response, and it was scathing. And I wish I had time to read this, but basically said, nice try, but sorry. Right, when we have stood by and another has stepped in, when we sit and grow bulky in our charming mansions, and a plain, uncouth peasant, which is what Father Damien was, steps in into the battle under the eyes of God, succors the afflicted, consoles the dying, and is himself afflicted in his turn, and dies upon the field of honor. The battle cannot be retrieved, as your unhappy irritation has suggested. It's a lost battle and lost forever. I would not want Robert Louis Stevenson mad at me, right? He knows how to write. So into this environment, very briefly, comes Joseph Dutton. And the reason there's an asterisk, and the reason I don't feel too badly that I'm shortchanging him, has to do with, what do we call it? White saviorism. He's a white savior, right? In the following sense. What's important in getting rid of the stigma of disease is to learn about the patients and their battles with the disease. It's not to learn about the people who came to look after him and subsequently became saints. Like Father Damien, he deserved to be a saint. Mother Mary Ann, she deserved to be a saint. Joseph Dutton is in the process of becoming a saint, and I disagree with that assessment. Good guy, very good guy, did a lot, but there's a line, and that's a little bit too far. Having said that, he's from Stowe, Vermont, and he fought in the Civil War. He got married, I would argue impulsively, after the war. That's what he looked like. His wife immediately left him because that was her nature, and he probably should have known that. And he spent the next 10 years pretty depressed and not behaving very well. Then he converted to Catholicism and said, I know what I can do. I can go to Molokai and help Father Damien. So he literally just showed up. Father Damien had no idea he was coming. He just showed up and said, I'm here to help, and spent the rest of his life there and did a lot of good. So that's him in the middle with a bunch of patients. This is him in the middle with lots more patients. This is him at the grave of Father Damien. And in Stowe, Vermont, there is a church, Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church, built in 1949. But what's interesting about it is that a French artist built murals of the life of Joseph Dutton on Molokai. The entire church is just an art display. Josephine Belloso worked with the artist. The murals were just restored this summer by master carver Matt Strong, lovely man. Here are the Von Trapps, who started the church and went to Molokai in honor of Joseph Dutton. Very briefly, this year, if you do your math, is the 150th anniversary of Hansen's discovery of the bacterium. This was a conference, international conference in Bergen, bringing together all the movers and shakers in the leprosy world, of which there are some, there are not many, which is a problem. You can see on the bottom, right, there's the iconic Hansen looking through a microscope. It was the logo of the conference. It's been put on stamps, both in Norway and Senegal, in Togo, right? He's a pretty famous guy. And the Sasakawa Foundation in Japan funded the conference, and there's a very thick book on the table by Sasakawa himself, whose life's mission is to do what he can to not forget leprosy. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Eve. The picture on the left is her, it's not a chapbook, there's a chapbook of poems from the perspective of the patients that was first published and won awards. And she then expanded it into the book on the right, which she will be selling afterwards in room 229.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, if anybody's interested, $15. There are books on the table. Will be in room 229. Eve was a link in a chain. There was a playwright who read Eve's poems and turned the story of the patients, excuse me, into a play. Isabel Barros was pregnant when she arrived on Penikese, so she had her baby taken away. And that's a reenactment of that scene. This was in New York. This was on Martha's Vineyard just recently. This is the cast. There's Eve, the top, middle. The playwright, Scott Barrow, is in the middle. And I'm going to turn things over to Eve, who has won many awards. And I apologize for shortchanging your intro. But let me turn things over to Eve. You want a mic?
Oh, yeah.
Just attach that wherever.
Hi,
Hi.
hi, thanks for having me. Thanks, Paul, at Applewood. Having me here, I just lost my mic, okay. It actually wasn't, Tom's book that got me interested. I discovered Tom's book while I was searching for info on Penikese. It was a documentary. I can't remember the guys who did it.
Ken Hartman,
Ken,
Lisa Schmidt.
an incredible man who did a documentary that was shown on NPR that I saw a gazillion years ago. And then I couldn't find it. And I now have a copy of it. And when I was reading W.S. Merwin's book, Folding Cliffs, the 19th century narrative of Hawaii, where he talks about the rise of leprosy, as it was called then, and how the English used it to separate people so they wouldn't have an uprising by shipping them all to Molokai. So it's an incredibly wonderful book by Merwin, if you want more information on that. And I'm just going to read a couple of poems from the book. The book deals with the very real people, as you saw from Paul's talk, that lived there. I only made up one person, and that was the cook. So I'm going to tell you about Isabel. As Paul said, she was pregnant when she came to the island. She already had 2 children. Her husband was a fisherman. When she was diagnosed, which was before Penikese opened, she was diagnosed in the spring and lived 5 months with her husband, whose name was Napoleon, was taking care of her, and her children were put into foster care. So it's a sad issue. Her husband drowned a year after she went to the island, and it's unclear if she was told of his death. I think she wasn't, but I've heard otherwise. So this is Isabel gives birth March 8th, 1906, and she came from the Azores, as many people in the area did. When my time came, waters rushed, belly clenched. Attendant Sarah's light fingers washed sweat from my face, walked me up and down. I cried for my husband, Napoleon. Dr. Edmonds hushed me, ordered me to push this babe, this child, so weak. I ached and howled. Feared my child tainted, sick to stay, or healthy, pulled away to live unheld by mother's arms. My son, my dear, born well, born screaming into this world, I name thee Leonine Lincoln Barrows. what little I could do for you, give you the name of the Board of Charities. Give you the name of the man in charge of all the wards of state, chairman of the Board of Charity. Will he have pity on the child that bears his name? I watched as Sarah cleaned you, wrapped you swaddling tight. In my arms, your clear eyes stare, my face to quick fade. Will someone tell you I loved you? Mary, it's so lonely here. I do that one short one and then a longer one that follows. And this one is called Willie Folded Sheets, and Willie's was Goonly Dip, the Chinaman, and he went by the nickname Willie. He did come from China. He left his wife there who had a son, and the $2 he made doing the laundry, he sent home to help his wife and child. Willie folds the sheets. Air still. Sheets hang straight, no billow or luff. Sun white glare. Eyes squint. Summer heat dry. Sheets scent fresh. Willie takes down and folds in linen dance. His wiry arms stretch out and together, cloth folded tightly made in willow basket. Willie breathes day, heat, and sheets, squares, bends to see black feather fallen on white. Air spin, sheets sail someplace far, someplace pushed away. His wife's hair, wings spread on pillow, their son curled into her. Their breath breathes gentle on this day, sun and sheets. That night, Willie places a feather on his pillow, dreams his wife stretched against him, dreams their legs, arms, all a tangle, dreams her hair, scent, body, musk. He breathes deep. In his dream, he sighs and moans. Wakes with pillow clenched, belly clutch, arms, shoulders, neck, heart aches. 1905 to 1921 was a tumultuous time in our history. We went through World War I, the sinking of the Titanic, the 146 women and children who died in a Triangle shirtwaist fire in New York City. In 1919, there was a molasses disaster in Boston. Fascinating story there. And the influenza epidemic. 1918, the angel of death walks the world outside. Dr. Parker tells the attendants to stay, too dangerous to leave. Newspapers daily tally the numbers, 7,122, one day, San Francisco. In Massachusetts, 85,000 in the month of September. Betsy's sister no longer asks her to visit, no longer tells her she is frightened for her. Stay. She says, here we breathe through handkerchiefs, shaking hands banned, schools closed, the ball fields deserted. Hyman gets a letter, his uncle, 2 brothers, dead. No mirrors to cover in sheets here. He can't remember the words of cottage. Marion finds him throwing stones into the waves, into the air, at the gulls. He throws and throws, lopsided, arcs, until spent, he sinks and sobs. And Ron says, spirits are crowding the skies. In Europe, Men breathe lung to rags and yellow blind dream of home. When the war ends, they stagger from the ships, find more dead than left, buried in France and Germany, in fields and forests. And the patients on this tiny island, cast away, cast out, forbidden, look at each other and wonder, and all the world turned upside down. And you say, like, here they were safe in that no one on Penikese Island contacted influenza. So they were safe from that, although all the world feared them to be contagious. And as we know, they weren't, you know, thankfully. So anyways, they came from Italy, Russia, Japan, the Azores. Three were Orthodox Jewish men. One had been a Hebrew teacher, and they had to get along on this tiny space. And most of the time they did. There were only 3 who really went mentally ill and suffered from severe depression, which is an incredible statistic for that many people dealing.
So that's it. Very much. Why don't you stay up here? And I realize there's 1 minute for questions. You're welcome to stay if you'd like. You're welcome to leave if you'd like. If you're interested in books, we'll be up in room 229 very shortly. And I think my mother has a question.
Yes, recently there's been publicity about an outbreak of Hansen's disease in Central Florida. And the interesting thing is the people have not been traveling elsewhere. And what can you comment about that?
So to rephrase the question, leprosy is now considered endemic in Central Florida as a result, again, of a handful of cases. These are people who haven't traveled anywhere. There's no reason to think that they were exposed. There's no known exposure. My first thought, and this is another interesting story, there's one, I didn't mention this, but one of the reasons that the bacteria is so hard to study is that there's only one animal model, the 9-banded armadillo. And they had lots of them at Carville because they were doing research. And animal rights activists were upset by this and released them all into the wild. So nice for the animals, but now the bacteria is in armadillos in the wild in Louisiana. So my first thought was maybe they got it from the armadillos, which is possible. But they ruled that out. These people also had no contact with armadillos. And so travel to Central Florida is now considered a risk factor for leprosy or Hansen's disease. I don't know why. It's a bacteria. It's very small. It does its own thing. It travels where it can, and it's now in Central Florida. There was also a case 10 or 15 years ago in upstate New York that had no known transmission, but it was a single case. And so travel to upstate New York is not considered a risk factor for leprosy, but Central Florida is. Take that, Ron DeSantis. Retribution. That's my theory. Question.
You mentioned earlier, I think that incidents around the equator, and yet we have a breakout intensity in Norway.
Yeah.
And now it's showing up in Florida. Does it have any temperature bound?
No, it's a good point. And I was wondering if anybody would pick up on that, right? Norway is not a tropical country, right? So why was that the epicenter for leprosy research? And the short answer is I don't know. But in Scandinavia at that time, they had a system for essentially dealing with homeless people. who are very poor, obviously. And their system was to have them travel around from farm to farm and work briefly. That's my alarm. And the best I can come up with was that's a recipe for spreading leprosy everywhere in Norway. There's no other rational explanation that I know of that would explain why there was such a high prevalence. I will say, and there are graphs that describe this, even before leprosy was essentially eradicated from Norway before antibiotics. So one thing, Hansen had no interest in becoming famous and having his name attached to the disease. What he cared about was eradicating leprosy. And so he argued against the system, right? If it's an infectious disease, please don't have people traveling around the country. So he got the Norwegian legislature to stop that. And suddenly all the cases started going down. So Norway had, starting in the mid 1800s, a chief officer for leprosy. And the last one resigned in about 1910 because there were a handful of cases, right? He couldn't justify his job because why bother at this point? So a very good question. Yes.
Your description of how that escaped person was tracked through different pharmacies. I, from the point of view of public health, that was terrific. But I wonder if that's against.
It's a good question, right? And the whole history. So sorry, the question is Richard Marx, who escaped Kalaupapa and was tracked down through his pharmacy records. Isn't that an invasion of privacy? And the history of leprosy is a history of patients' rights, right? It's public interest, public health versus individual rights. And that it's not only the case in leprosy, but it's pretty stark contrast in the case of leprosy. And that would have happened before the 60s because Richard Marx was responsible in the late 60s for ending the quarantine on Kalaupapa. So we weren't that sophisticated about patients' rights before the 1960s. So it was probably not illegal, but even if it were, I'm sure there were plenty of people who thought the public interest in tracking him down and getting him back to Hawaii outweighed whatever, minor rights he might have. Nancy has a question. Yeah. I can hear you and I'll repeat your question.
I'm not at all sure that they're accurate at all. Terrible dissemination of scary images. But can you talk a little bit about leprosy away from themselves?
Yeah, so the question is, people have images of people with leprosy that don't match the ones that I showed you. And the short answer is, if left untreated, it can be horribly disfiguring. Because it likes the cooler parts of your body, it affects the skin. There are rashes. The atlas from 1847, if you're interested, is right here. And you can see some of those pictures. That takes decades to get to that point. I will tell you a myth. Fingers and toes don't fall off. However, if you can't feel your fingers and toes, what happens is you injure them a lot over a very long period of time, and the bones start receding. And so eventually there's claw hand. That's a real effect of the disease if left untreated for decades. And so it's not that those images aren't actually real, but they aren't common these days. The other piece of that answer is that we tend to think we have an image of leprosy from the Bible. That's a misnomer. That's a mistranslation from a 12th century Greek translator who translated lepra to refer to all of those horrible skin conditions that we attach to leprosy. And with that one word, he took all of the stigma that was attached to this biblical image of leprosy and put it square on the shoulders of the bacterium. It was in Jesus's day, he was a real person. What is described in the Bible was probably every skin condition you could possibly imagine, right? They didn't know anything about bacteria. So that's every bad skin condition got thrown on the back of leprosy, which is a bad skin condition if left untreated. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, thank you.
I would just like to ask about the 33 persons who were at the island who were immigrants. And was our government testing for leprosy as they entered?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So
What's the question?
I'm sorry, the 33 immigrants on Penikese, how did we know they had leprosy, right? How was it diagnosed 100 years ago? And the short answer is we were quite sophisticated back then. I say, medical science was quite sophisticated in diagnosing leprosy. I had the same question. And essentially that group at Harvard knew leprosy when they saw it. And they knew what wasn't leprosy when they saw it. And so they would send them off to the lab and they would get tested and they would come back. I'm not 100% sure, but it's pretty clear that the people who were sent to Penikese did in fact have leprosy. The first superintendent, by the way, Lewis Edmonds, tried very hard to convince everybody that Isabel Barros was cured because he didn't want to have to deal with a pregnant patient on the island. He literally declared her cured and told her she was cured. So she thought she was leaving and only to discover, no, sorry, your mistake. She still has leprosy. You're staying and we're taking your children away. But also a very good question. Sorry to answer a little bit further. There was, so Gallops Island, which is in the Boston Harbor, was the entry point. It was sort of the, Ellis Island for a lot of people coming into the United States. And it was the quarantine island. So why they didn't put the patients there, I also don't know. But patients did have a medical exam as part of their entry into the United States. There are a number of patients who were deported, were diagnosed and sent home before they ended up on Penikese. And one of the graphs that I glossed over had how long these patients stayed on Penikese. And a lot of them were there a year or less because they were deported. That's a longer answer to your question, but thank you. All right, I'm gonna wrap up. Anybody who wants to stay is welcome to. I appreciate your attention and I want to thank you for being here and thank you for. Thank you.
Thank you too. I enjoyed it a great deal. Very interesting.
I'm
Appreciate
glad you did.
Okay.
For a great.
Very informative and